Hello, my name is Justin Gassel, and for my rhetorical criticism paper, I chose to look at a initial response by the CDC regarding COVID back in late January, early February, and I chose to look at that through fantasy theme analysis. I think these two pair really well together, as not only does the CDC report give information about what the state of the pandemic was back in late January, early February, but also it gives some guidelines and recommendations that healthcare providers and the general public should follow. So it does have rhetorical value there. And deconstructing this report into themes and looking at kind of what worldview the CDC was trying to establish at the beginning of this pandemic seemed really interesting, and that fantasy theme would be the perfect way to analyze and critique this piece of rhetoric. So what I did is I broke this report down into kind of two categories of themes. The first category was the preliminary information about the pandemic. And then the second was the actual persuasive messages or guidelines that they gave to healthcare providers and the public. So looking at the first set of themes, there were less than 300 cases when this report was given. However, this was across 36 states. So there is definitely a very broad audience that this message would have to go out to. So when we look at the second set of themes, we'll notice that they're very vague and very broad, but that's because they had a very wide audience that they were trying to reach. Beyond that, there really isn't much in terms of action in the first set of themes. It really sets up the characters, which are the US public, the CDC, and the healthcare providers. And then the actions really found in the second set of themes, which is the actual rhetorical messages. And these are the guidelines that the CDC was starting to send out. They were mostly sent to the healthcare providers, and it was information like if you come into contact with a patient, make sure that they're wearing a mask, that they're 6 feet apart, that they are distanced and isolated from others, and specifically to make sure that the elderly who have pre-existing health conditions were the ones who were like especially taken care of because they were the high risk at this time. The CDC mentions that the general public who had no contact with anyone was basically not at risk. And so the persuasive messages are really just these precautions, these very basic wash your hands, if you're sick, stay home, very kind of messages. And so what these two themes paint a worldview of is that the CDC was taking a very reactive measure to the pandemic, and they weren't very proactive. They were kind of waiting to see if these basic guidelines would work, if these basic guidelines would be enough to quell this disease, rather than taking a very proactive approach and really stepping in with a bunch of stricter guidelines. But from their perspective and from the worldview that they were trying to construct, they didn't want to create a bunch of panic. Rather, they just wanted to kind of be cautious and make sure that people who were infected were getting treatment, and those who weren't infected were doing basic health protocols to stay healthy. In the end, I find this as a rhetorical artifact kind of weak. While to healthcare providers, it seemed pretty strong, to the rest of the American public, this really wouldn't subscribe anybody to want to really follow. The only credibility that is found here is the information on the actual pandemic. And at this time, the pandemic was not nearly as large or threatening as it is today. So there really isn't a lot of urgency within this report, which makes sense seeing that it is a preliminary report at the beginning. It is interesting to look at the worldview that the CDC was trying to establish and realize that they were taking a more reactive measure to it and not really focusing on stopping this virus as quickly as possible, but rather waiting to see kind of what happened and then addressing it from there. However, they do state that they were definitely trying to be as aggressive as possible and that they would update information when they had it. So this very preliminary report persuasively isn't that strong, but one could argue that it's because that wasn't the point of it. The point was just to bring information about this pandemic to healthcare providers specifically and to the American people second. And so through fantasy theme analysis, we really can see the motivations behind the CDC and kind of why they chose to go the route they did, and kind of how these guidelines could help lessen the blow when the pandemic started to really pick up. In their eyes, they were trying to keep it from getting bad by having more treatment on those who were getting it rather than a more overall proactive measure. It was a very interesting article, and it was a really good like paper to write. So cool. I hope you all look into the CDC's responses and kind of see what persuasive tactics they used.